Hey, what's up? I tried to get myself together before this because I'm always rushing home from work and jumping on the SciCommunity for my evenings of Enology. And I actually took time today to go home and shower. And in an attempt to try and shower and fix myself, I actually made my hair even more complicated. Who'd have thunk, right? Hey, grad self-care, how's it going? So my name is Caileen, and I have been sitting in front of my camera by myself. Well, that's not true, actually. I have been talking to the science community about wine and viticulture and enology now for 10 weeks, which is insane. For the first half of Evenings of Enology, I was able to have guests on, which is fantastic. But with the timing of this show, it coincided with a time in the wine industry called harvest, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. And that means that I could no longer rely on winemakers to be available because they're at the whim of Mother Nature. And whenever grapes come in, they have to deal with them. So I switched the format about halfway through to just me sitting and talking on my phone to all of you. And it's been really awesome. I've been so thankful for the engagement and for the community and for the support. And so, I want to get that out of the way first because if you weren't here to engage with me and hang out with me and ask me weird, awesome, fantastic questions about wine, I would literally be sitting by myself on my couch drinking wine, which I do anyway. I don't need anybody for that, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for the science community for hosting this. And thank you to Dan and Michelle and Gabe for organizing this. And thank you to all of the guests who have come on. Hey, howdy. Thank you to all the guests who have come on, whether they're winemakers or viticulturists, if they've taken time out of their very, very busy day to sit down with me and sit down with us and give us an insight into this weird, mystical world that lives behind these bottles on shelves in Safeway. I want to thank them too. So the people we've had on the show have been Barry Jackson of Equinox. You can follow Equinox Cellars if you want to keep up with Barry and what he's doing there. We talked about sparkling wine and the champagne method. We talked to, and this is not in the correct order because I'm thinking I'm going to fork it up, but Brian Farrell from Calesta Vineyards in Paso. And we talked about the external impacts that can happen on fermentation, how they can affect fermentation. You can follow him, Brian Farrell Jr. We talked to Megan Bell of Margins Wine. I think I'm skipping an episode here. I'll get back to that in a second. But Megan Bell of Margins Wine in Santa Cruz, California. We talked to her about the natural winemaking method and how it differs from conventional winemaking. That episode is up on Nexus, as is all these episodes. We talked to Ken Swaggles of Rises Viticulture on sustainable viticulture and farming grapes, because obviously you have to, wine isn't just this liquid beverage. I mean, it is a liquid beverage of alcohol and acid and tannin, but it had to start somewhere, and it starts in a vineyard, it starts in a farm. And so we talked about farming as well. We also talked to Abby Crystal. She's another enologist, about common methods and common techniques that we use in an enology lab. And that was just 6 episodes. So thank you to all the guests who came on and hung out with us. And if you want to keep up with them, please do and support them, because they are fantastic people as well as brilliant winemakers and fantastic people to have in the community. So that was my 3-minute thanking all of the people who helped put this together. And then I sat in front of my phone for 5 episodes and talked by myself. So what are you gonna do? All right, so yesterday I very randomly went on my Instagram and went live and had you guys help me pick out a wine for tonight. So you picked out this wine. Maybe not you in particular, but the people who joined me live randomly on my Instagram helped me pick out this wine. So this is from my winery. Well, not my winery. I don't own it. This is from the winery that I work at. This is a Cabernet and Syrah blend co-fermented with Viognier. So we haven't touched on the topic of co-fermentation before, but very commonly in the northern Rhone region of France, which is South France. So the northern region of the South region of France is an area called Condrieu or Saint-Joseph, Hermitage. These are all areas within that northern Rhone that work with Syrah and a varietal called Viognier. And oftentimes we will add Viognier, which is a white varietal, a white aromatic varietal that, if you remember from the different chemicals that we can find in wine, Viognier is high in terpenes, which are these molecules that give rise to aromatics. And so you can co-ferment, meaning you have a bin or a vessel full of Syrah grapes, which are a red varietal, and you can throw in, a handful, maybe like 1 to 3% usually, of a white varietal like Viognier. And what it does is it adds a little bit of femininity to the wines because they are high in these aromatics, these terpenes and stuff. In your red wine, you now have these components and aromas of like white flower and gardenia and things that you wouldn't typically find in a red wine. And so the wine that I'm drinking is Syrah co-fermented with a little bit of Viognier and Cabernet Sauvignon as well. So thanks for helping me pick that out. I was so indecisive. Okay, so my story in wine. And please, at any point in time, ask any questions. I am literally here to answer, demystify, give you the garbage, give you the good on anything in the wine industry or anything in wine at all. I promise you, I'll try and have like a little bit of a filter because this isn't my personal Instagram. But I will give you a very, very honest answer. Because like a lot of things in science, wine also isn't easy. Whew, but it's awesome. It's rad. Okay, so my story in wine. I feel like I'm like sitting down like, let me tell you my story. I guess that's what I'm doing. Oh, and thank you for letting me delay this by a week, by the way, because last Tuesday I got my wisdom teeth pulled out and like I don't remember most of the day. I was under so much anesthesia. It's insane. So that would have been a mess. But I got started in wine realistically, kind of when I was like 18. So I'm in the United States. I'm in California right now, but I'm from Washington originally. And the drinking age is 21. But my mom has always been big on demystifying things. And she introduced wine to me at a young age by like having me have a few sips of wine with dinner. And just talking to me about it, being like, it's from this place. She didn't know a lot about wine, but she knew she liked it. And she knew that it was important that I saw wine as a thing that you consumed for pleasure and enjoyment and not for getting trashed or drunk. And to this day, I have a very lovely relationship with wine. It's great. But when I got into college, I, kept doing this wine thing with mom and always kept it on the back burner as something that was really cool. I find oftentimes that people and cultures that have a really good relationship with wine or alcohol in general tend to demystify it and introduce it to their kids earlier, just as a general rule of thumb. And this is my opinion, but this is also what I've seen across a bunch of different populations. So science low, but experience heavy on that comment. Got into college, and as soon as I turned 21, I started taking a notebook around. And this is just any old notebook that you can find. Whatever, doesn't really matter. And I would take this notebook around to all the tastings that I went to. So I lived in an area of Washington. So Washington is split in two geographically, essentially. There's the desert half where they grow all the wine. And then there's the wet half, which is what you think of when you think of Seattle and stuff like that. So there's not a lot of vineyards or wine growing regions in the west half of Washington state, but there are a lot of wine bars and tasting rooms. And so I would go to wine bars or tasting rooms whenever they had tastings or flights. And I would write down what the wine was, the day I was drinking it, what the vintage was, obviously, because that's important for remembering, when you drank it versus when it was made, harvested. And then where it's from, of course. And then I would take notes on what it looks like, what it smells like, what it tastes like, and what it feels like. Because we've talked a lot before on Evenings of Enology how the way a wine is perceived on your palate is a function not only of how it just tastes in general, but more so how the structural components that are in wine actually play together to create that feeling and that sense of whatever it is on your palate. And so I just wrote all that shit down. And then I would take my notes home and I would compare them against common literature. So like in my opinion, and there's a few wine Bibles and wine books that I love and preach, and I'll tell them to you, because I think if you have any interest in wine whatsoever, some of these books are really, really helpful. So what I had on my bedside that was basically like my wine go-to book was Jancis Robinson's Oxford Companion to Wine. This book's huge, huge. Jancis Robinson was the first female master of wine. So not a master somm, a master of wine. And she is now highly regarded as one of the most influential figures in the wine world, end of sentence, regardless of gender. And I would say arguably top 3, maybe even top 2, maybe first place. I don't know. She's up there for sure. Women in wine ever. Beautiful, genius writer, and goes over everything. So I would take my notes home and I would compare it against the Oxford Companion to Wine. And I would see what I maybe did pick up, what I didn't pick up. And I just did that for years. I carried a notebook around. And then after a couple of years, I was like, okay, I think I kind of maybe sort of know what I'm doing now. Story of my life, by the way. I maybe kind of sort of know what I'm doing now. So I started to host. Please ask me any questions, by the way. Please, like any question. This is the zone of no judgment. You cannot ask a bad question. I am only here because I've asked so many flippin' questions of people. So ask me any question while you have me. Please, 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 please. So after like a year and a half, I decided to start teaching classes on sensory mostly. So wine tasting and wine education classes. Because at that point, I also knew a lot about wine history and about varietals and where they come from and why they come from there and all of that stuff. And so I would just host very informal classes, either at my house, honestly, or at wine bars that would host me. And what I would usually do is I would work with either the wine bar or myself, and I would pick a flight of wines that I thought exemplified whatever it was that I was trying to teach. So one day, I believe I was discussing salinity in white wines, because some white wines actually taste kind of like oysters, or they taste like saltine crackers. And it's really flippin' cool. And so I would design a flight of 5 wines, paid like $20. And then I would just tell them where those flavors come from and how to recognize those flavors. Or, these wines are high in terpenes. These are what terpenes are. This is where they come from. This is how to recognize wines. I would host classes on how to blind taste wines. So I know a lot of people have mixed feelings on blind wine tasting because everybody gives that shitty example. Hey, howdy. Everyone gives that example that I flippin' hate, where they're like, I read once that someone put red food dye in a white wine and they thought it was a red wine. Yes, of course they thought it was a red wine. It was red. Like, that's the blind wine tasting does not mean you're actually blind. And I understand that for a person who is visually impaired, it could literally be blind wine tasting. But one of the things we take into consideration when we're looking at a wine is color. So yes, when we blind a wine, we look at the color. Get over it. Anyway, all that was to say, when you blind a wine, you typically look at those wines and decide if they're from a region based on what they're structurally like and what their aromatic profile is like, as well as what winemaking techniques you can pick up. And so I would teach classes on how to figure out what winemaking techniques were being used and then teach students how to correlate that to certain areas. Because wine, as much as it is an agricultural product, is also a historical product. It's been around for a really long time, and cultures and people and populations have enjoyed it for hundreds of years. And so certain bubbles within the world have certain ways of doing things. And if you pick up on those winemaking practices on your palate, you can blind a wine in that setting. So what does a wine's color tell you? Like shades of red or shades of white? That is a great question. So let's talk about shades of red first. So what I can pick up from a color of a red wine, well, let's think about it first in intensity, and then we'll go into actual color. So there's low intensity red wines, so like lighter red wines, and then there's darker red wines. what you can mostly deduce from the intensity of the color of a wine is the intensity of the skins. So how thick are the skins? Because remember, as we mentioned in Evenings of Enology, the phenol compounds, the phenolic compounds that give rise to color are called anthocyanins. And anthocyanins are in the skins of wine grapes. And so if you have a wine that's very dark in color and very intense, that's going to mean that that has a very thick skin varietal. So if you know what varieties have thick skins, you can put them on this end of the spectrum as opposed to this end of the spectrum. Pinot Noir, for example, is a very thin-skinned varietal. Gamay is a very thin-skinned varietal, so it's going to be on the lower end of intensity. Syrah, Cabernet, like this is like the color of like blood almost. It's very dark. It's a Syrah Cabernet blend. That's going to be on the darker, more intense profile of a wine. Then we can also think of colors in general. So certain varietals, and this is not as obvious, but depending on your anthocyanin content, you can either be more purple or more red. And certain varieties are more purple and certain varieties are more red. Syrah tends to be more purple. Merlot tends to be more red. That's just a function of their anthocyanin content. If we're thinking about white wines in color now, and within red wines, so you can also look at how much oxidation is in that wine. So when anthocyanins get oxidized, which is going to happen as a function of time because that cork closure, natural cork lets in O2 at a very, very slow rate. It's called nano-oxidation. And when anthocyanins get oxidized very slowly, they start to turn brownish, almost like brick-y color. So if you look at your glass of wine and you see that on the rim of that glass of wine is kind of a browny, brick-y color, it's probably oxidized. And oxidation can happen either from a winemaking practice or from age, most commonly age. So if you see that rim of your wine glass that has these sort of brownish, burnt colors, and it's a red wine, and it smells a little bit like bruised fruit or old fruit, as we mentioned before in Evenings of Enology when we talk about oxidation, you can assume it's an older wine. So that's how we think about color for the red wine spectrum. And in the white wine spectrum, white wines are interesting because they are less so, their color is less so a function of the skins because they are typically pressed off the skin, and more so a function of winemaking practices and the grape itself. So flesh does have a little bit of color in it. So certain varieties, skin and flesh do play a role in the color, like Pinot Gris, for example. Pinot Gris means gray Pinot, and it has this sort of like rose-ish colored tone to it. And so Pinot Gris itself does have like actually a little bit of a pink hue, which is kind of nice. But oftentimes with white wines, what you're going to see most in color is oxidation. And oxidation looks almost the same in a white wine as it does in a red wine. It gets kind of that more burnt color, maybe more golden color. And so when we're thinking of white wines, we typically think of oxidation as a thing that's going to affect color. But varietal typicity does also play a role in the color of white wines. But I hope that answered your question. Let me know if I did or did not answer your question at all. Does the phenolic content of a wine vary between small scale and large commercial scale vineyards for a given varietal? That is a great question. The phenolic content of a wine or a varietal, I'm going to say, so a grape, a pre-wine, is not going to vary much between small producer and large commercial growers. What will probably change is how they treat their phenolics. So oftentimes, good, awesome. I'm glad I can answer that question for you. So oftentimes in those big commercial wineries, you're working with like million-gallon tanks. And so you're not going to introduce oxidation in a slow manner. And oxidation helps turn those smaller chain tannins into longer chain tannins. It acts as almost a catalyst. And so in commercial wineries, you may find that their treatment of their wines changes their phenolic structure, but inherently the phenolics aren't really going to change. What's going to change the most, I believe, between commercial wineries and small wineries on the phenolics topic is most likely when they're harvesting, because your tannin profile changes as a function of harvest. And if you're a small production, you're probably going in your vineyard and sampling and tasting those phenolics and seeing if you have the right kind of skin tannins that you're looking for, if you have the right kind of seed lignification that you're looking for. And so I don't think that small scale wineries and large commercial wineries are going to change in their phenolic content of a varietal, but rather when they harvest those wines is going to change their phenolic profile, and what they do with them is going to change. But the variety itself isn't going to be fundamentally different. It's just what you do with it, essentially. I hope that answered your question. I had Moscato for the first time this past weekend. Is that one of the highest wines in terms of sugar content? Good question. Yeah. So Moscato, typically seen as Moscato di Asti. So Moscato from the region of Asti in Italy. I always have to do like never eat soggy waffles for northeast, southwest, but northeastern Italy, I believe. And Moscato is a wine that has a stopped ferment around 8 to 10% alcohol by volume. So its residual sugar content is really high. And Moscato as a varietal is crazy weird. Like there's something like 200 different varieties of Moscato. It's insane. And the grape itself, if you look at Moscato, is a huge grape. So a lot of these grapes that we're talking about, don't think of the grapes that you think of when you go to the grocery store and buy grapes. Think of like really tiny grapes, like the size of like the top of your pinky small. And Moscato almost looks like a grape that you would find in a grocery store. And as a consequence, it has a really high flesh content. And the flesh is where the sugar lies. And so traditionally in Moscato, you would stop the ferment around 8 to 10% alcohol by volume and leave residual sugar. So as a wine that people would most commonly consume, i.e. like a consumer known wine that is not considered a dessert wine necessarily, Moscato is one of the highest in residual sugar for sure. Moscato also plays this really weird role in the world of wine where it's not really a dessert wine, although some consider it a dessert wine, and there are dessert styles, but it's not really a dry wine either, obviously. So it's a wine with residual sugar. But there are regions, most notably in France, working with a varietal called Chenin Blanc in Vouvray. They will do styles that are demi-sec, or translates roughly into kind of dry. You'll also see wines with residual sugar, like Riesling will have residual sugar sometimes. Any wine can have residual sugar if you stop the fermentation. It's just a matter of what varietals you typically see it in. Moscato is one of them. Riesling is one of them. Chenin, Gewürztraminer, mostly white varietals. And then some also turn into dessert wines. So yeah, Moscato is also just like a crazy, weird process. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. Side note, I'm really glad I opened that yesterday. It's actually better on day 2. I'm excited to see how it tastes tomorrow. Oxidation. So much fun. Okay. Again, any and all questions are welcome. I'm just going to go ranting on my experience in wine because that's what I know. So after I was teaching these small classes in Bellingham, oh, lovely. Can you explain a little bit about the reason for the color differences? Yeah. So light's complicated, right? So light comes into systems, and typically systems that have what's called a pi conjugated system are going to interact with light that we can see. So what that means in organic chemistry terms is you have 2 molecules, right? And they're bonded together. So my hands are 2 atoms, and my fingers are the bond holding them together. This is a single bond. Sometimes you can have what's called a double bond that looks like this. And in this double bond, you have a set of what are called electrons. This is going to make sense, I swear. No, this is going to relate back to wine, I promise. It sounds like it's not, but it's going to. So these electrons resonate, right? And within a molecule that we've talked quite a bit about in Evenings of Enology, anthocyanins are cyclic structures that have a very extensive pi bonding network. And there are multiple kinds of anthocyanins. There's epicatechin, there's catechin, there's like epi3 gallocatechin. And all this is to say that those different resonances are going to absorb and diffract light differently. And so you see differences in color in wine fundamentally as a function of the proportion of what kinds of anthocyanins they have in their skins and how many anthocyanins they have in their skins with respect towards one another. And then the oxidation of those anthocyanins, the slow oxidation of those anthocyanins over time is going to give your wines that kind of more darky kind of brick browny sort of color. So it really just comes down to the molecular structure of these compounds that give rise to color and what their balance is in reference to one another. So I hope that answered your question. But the color of wine, again, is a function of anthocyanin content, and that's going to change with every wine, and they're going to oxidize as a function of time. I hope that answered your question. Let me know if it did not. Yay, good. I'm glad you liked it. Awesome. Okay, so after I did my wine education thingy in Washington, I was like, okay, I'm going to grad school now in California. Peace, Washington, I'm out. And I moved down to California. And I moved down here and started just, again, going into tasting rooms. This is, if you want to get in the wine industry, go to a winery and talk to people in the winery. They probably know what's up. I would go to a tasting room, and there was one tasting room that I went to a lot. It's called Santa Cruz Mountain Vineyard. So I'm in Santa Cruz, California. And I would taste their wines and bring my notebook. I'm still bringing my notebook everywhere, mind you. Like, I've been doing this for 3 years now, still have a notebook. Brought it around, took notes, whatever, and talked to people. I ended up talking to, at the time, the assistant winemaker, Ken Swegels, episode 3 of Evening of Enology. That's how I met him. And his wife, Abby, episode 6, I believe, Evenings of Enology, maybe 4, I can't remember. And Abby was like, you're smart. Do you want a job? Like, I work at a winery that needs someone just to work in their tasting room. And I was like, yeah, dude, I would love to get behind the bar in a tasting room. That sounds awesome. And the winery was so small that I also got to just do general cellar rat stuff. So a cellar rat, is like slang for somebody who just does anything and everything in a winery in a cellar. Usually kind of bottom of the barrel work. So things like punch downs, which is where you have to like literally push a cap of fermenting fruit back down over and over and over again. You'll end up doing stuff like cleaning out kegs. Like it's the grunt work of the winery, but it just has to happen, right? And so I took that job. And I started working behind the bar, and Andy, who just joined, visited me a lot. Not a lot, but I would have him come hang out with me on Saturdays because my dog would always come hang out at the winery as well. And, you know, people love Owen. They love my dog almost more than me sometimes, I swear. Hey, Andy. And so I worked behind that bar for a couple of years, and I actually still, I love the owners still. I actually was just working for them for a few hours this last Saturday. They're great. And I decided at some point that I wanted to get into the wine science side of the industry. And so Abby, who you maybe know from this show, said, I can maybe get you a job at Bonnie Doon. And I was like, cool, rad. And so keep in mind also, this whole time I'm also doing my PhD in chemistry. So I'm still doing the science, still doing my PhD, which is actually, it's going to be in chemistry, but it's more in biochemistry. Let's be realistic. How do you recommend going about pairing food with wine? What qualities of a wine should you pay attention to when planning your menu? Fantastic question. And I wanted to do an episode on this, but I just ran out of time, and it was more, SAMI than Enology, but I'm so stoked to answer it here. So when you're thinking about pairing food with wine, you want to think about those structural components of wine. So we talked in the structure and function episode about tannins, acid, and alcohol. Acid is acid. It's things like tartaric acid, it's malic acid, it's citric acid, succinic acid, and these are things that are going to sit on the back of your palate and make your mouth water. Tannins are the things that are going to bind to proteins and make your mouth feel really dry because your saliva has fats and proteins. And alcohol is the thing that we all drink because it's wine and not grape juice. So when I'm thinking about pairing a menu, I'm thinking about those structural components and what they do. So acid is really good at cutting fat. So if I have a high fat menu, I'm going to try and pair it with wines that are very high acid. There are also certain wines that have more herbaceous characteristics, and I'll oftentimes pair those with vegetables. Vegetables are really hard to pair, and so I try and choose wines that are high in, we've talked about these pyrazinic compounds before on Evenings of Enology as well. So pyrazinic compounds are the compounds that give rise to like this green pepper characteristic. They are in the Bordeaux family of red varietals. They're also in Gruner Veltliner and a handful of other white varietals. So if I have a vegetable dish that I'm having a hard time pairing and I don't have a bunch of like meats or fats around, I'll go to those wines that are white wines with pyrazinic compounds. If I have a high fat dish, I'm going to try and go for something high acid. And red wines and white wines can be high acid. And that's, you're going to be able to recognize acid as a consumer because it's going to make the back of your mouth water and your mouth is going to feel wet and sticky, almost more so than dry. If I have a dish that is high in protein, I'm going to go for something that's high in tannin, which is almost always going to be a red wine. And the reason is because once you consume food that's high in proteins, like let's do a classic, almost a little cliche pairing, but whatever, it gets the point across, of a steak. If I am consuming a steak and I have, steak all up in my mouth or whatever, and I drink a red wine that is high in tannin, suddenly now all of the protein that I've been eating in my food is going to be bound up with that wine and not my saliva. So as a consequence, that wine's going to feel very different on my palate than had I consumed it on its own. And that's how wine pairing works. You want to be able to pair a food and a wine structurally such that it brings out qualities in the wine that are either different or better than we have experienced before. And so the short answer is to look at structural components of both your food and your wine and pair them accordingly by what complements another and what contrasts another one. So it's not necessarily like I'm having a burger and you have red wine with burgers, or I'm having shellfish, so I should have something that smells like shellfish. It's what structures are you looking at in food and how do they pair nicely? So that's the answer. But also sometimes aromatics do play a role because it's just fun. It's honestly really fun. And when in doubt, champagne. Champagne pairs with like almost everything. I swear to God, it's an amazing beverage. Also, champagne, if you've never tried this before, if you have learned nothing from me this entire series, champagne, popcorn, fried chicken, French fries, all amazing pairings. Champagne and fried food is like God's gift to us to remind us that he loves us. It's awesome. What am I working on during my PhD? Right. It's funny. It's actually kind of funny that you asked this question. I'm really happy that you did. I've been on the SciCommunity now doing stuff about education and pedagogy and leadership and mentorship in wine, and absolutely none of that has to do with my PhD. None. I'm qualified to talk about all those things based on my resume, but it's nothing about my PhD. So I work in a cancer biology lab, and I study a protein that is upregulated in all known and studied cancers. It's called forkhead box M1, and it is intrinsically disordered. It's a huge pain in the ass. But because it's upregulated in every single studied cancer, it's a very attractive cancer therapeutic. And so I am looking at the characterization of that protein and determining how it is activated from a biochemical and a biophysical perspective. So I'm looking at it structurally, even though it's unstructured, bane of my existence. And I'm looking at the mechanism that it goes under to become active. Because once it's active in your cell where it shouldn't be, once it's misregulated, which is what cancer does, you're probably already you're at least in stage 2, probably stage 3 or stage 4. It's a classic biomarker. contributes to chemo resistance. It contributes to metastasis. And so I am studying that. I'm in a cancer biology lab using biophysics and biochemistry to study that. And then I also work at a winery doing wine stuff. Okay. These are awesome questions, by the way. Thank you so much. I don't drink wine in particular, but your knowledge is so fascinating and I enjoyed your sessions. Oh, thank you. That makes me really happy. I would smile more, but it still hurts to smile because I got my teeth pulled on my face like a week ago, but that really does make me so happy. I'm glad you enjoyed this. Thank you. Anybody else drinking wine? I don't know what time zone you're in. I don't know if it's like permittable. But I'm gonna have a thank you. Cheers. Cheers, friend. Okay, so did the tasting room thing. Left. How do you manage work-life balance doing both? How do you manage? Google Calendar. Google Calendar. Yeah. Without Google Calendar, I'd be screwed. So, if we're gonna get into personal stories here, because I don't know, they're nice. When I moved to California, I was single, and I moved here, and I was like, "This is great. No one knows me. Like I can be me and do my thing for as long as I want." And then I met my boyfriend like 6 days off the plane. Seriously. And we were together for a little over 3 years. And the Bay Area of California is very, very expensive. Very expensive. It's the most expensive metropolitan area in all of the United States. And so when I left him, I had my dog, I was in a situation where I wanted to live by myself because I was just kind of over people at that point. And I needed a place that was dog friendly, and I didn't want someone to try and mess with my dog or like train my dog because I had paid out the asshole to train him basically at like Doggy Stanford. And so I moved into this place, which is where I'm currently at right now. And my rent went up like 160%. And at the same time that I was moving out from my boyfriend's house, our old house, my car also broke down, had to buy a new car. And life just got really expensive really fast. And I had no one to split bills with anymore. And so at that point, it was, what do I have in my belt that can help me make more money? And I'm not going to get a raise in my PhD. I'm salaried or I'm on a fellowship right now, but I was salaried at the time. I cannot get a raise. I know about wine. So I distinctly remember my ex came over because we're still good friends. I still talk to him. It's actually, my mom says it's my superpower being friends with all my exes. I really am. I'm good friends with them all. And he came over and we're just like shooting the shit and talking. And this is like, I don't know, almost been a year ago, actually. I've been in my position for about a year. Crazy. And we had a good time. And then I said, I got to go. I'm going to go meet up with Audrey and Derek. And in my head, I had planned to talk to these people about getting a job. So the people that I know, my friends, are, this is going to come back to answer your question, I swear to God. My friends are related. So is the brother of the people who own the winery. Technically, the whole family owns the winery, but the brother is the head winemaker. So I knew I was going to go there and talk to them about that. And when I left my ex, I had the classic breakdown of like, did I make the wrong decision? What am I doing? Why did I leave this person? Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, basically. And I was like driving to their house, just crying. And I almost turned around. I literally almost turned my car around. And as I was driving, I was like, Caileen, like, you need to do this. You need to like do something for yourself. You need to challenge yourself. Keep driving. This is going to be fine. Cried out in the car. Just fucking get your shit together. Get your shit together, Bryson. So I get to their house and I drive all the way up their driveway. They live up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And I said, hey, because the Bonnie Doon thing didn't work out that I was mentioning before. So I said, hey, I don't know if you need help in the winery, but I want to get back in the industry. And this is the skill set that I have. And this is what I know. Like, do you guys need anybody? I just completely cold called them, asked. And she's like, you know what? We do need help. Like, we're screwed. I'll talk to them. I'll see if I'll get back to you. Give me a couple days. And I was like, sick. That was easy. And then maybe dinner and gave me wine. It's actually worked out really well. I'm glad I didn't turn my freaking car around. If it's scary, keep doing it, right? So I get an email from her a couple days later saying like, hey, yeah, we made you a position. Can you start on Monday? I was like, whoa, damn. Sure. And I've been there ever since. And I got a raise, actually. Like, I got like a $2 an hour raise within like a couple of weeks. So to answer your question in a very long way, I balance it because I have to. I have no other choice. I financially wouldn't be able to make it work in the place that I live by myself without either pulling out student loans that I don't want to do or having a second job. So in the Bay Area, it's actually pretty common to have a second job. And I wanted to have one that would benefit me both professionally and personally. And so I took the position that they made for me very kindly. So Google Calendar is a short answer. The long answer is I have no other option because all the shit hit every fan all at once and I needed to unfuck it. Sorry, Dan. That was a lot of swear words. Sorry, SciCommunity. That was a lot of swear words. But yeah, that's it. I had no choice. And I love it. I mean, it's really stressful sometimes, and especially right now during harvest. Harvest is a time. Thank you guys. Thank you. It was like me, like, here's my heart. Just, harvest is stressful as hell. Don't let anybody tell you any different. It's also really romantic and it's really beautiful. And you are bringing in fruit that's going to last your winery for, a year or two. And that's really gorgeous. But everybody is so stressed out. And one thing that I wanted to mention that I haven't got a chance to mention yet on this, because I don't always love talking about this, but it's really important to me. And so if you don't want to hear me rant on this, please feel free to leave. But I hope you do because it's important. So there's a lot of talk right now about women in science and women in chem and women in STEM and all that stuff. And that's really great. In the biological sciences and in chemistry, the amount of PhDs that are female in these areas is anywhere from like 30 to 40%, depending on the area that you're looking at, which is awful. However, women in wine is atrociously terrible. So if you look at the percentages of women who are lead winemakers in California, because that's where I'm at, California, United States of America, on average, it's about 10%. And most regions are anywhere from 4 to 7% for women in wine, which is awful. And so I spend a lot of time trying to deal with people who don't know how to support women in the industry. And that's really, really hard. And so one thing I do want to say about, I've waxed poetic on the industry for a long time, and I'm going to keep waxing poetic, but I just want to take a reality slap for a minute. You got to be gritty if you're going to be a female in the industry, and you got to be tough. Even just the other day, at work. And again, I love my workplace. My bosses are awesome. They're just stressed out as all get out and they can't manage their emotions because, well, I have my opinions, but whatever. They're stressed out and they're taking it out on someone who can't handle it, which is me. Because again, as a woman in science and a woman in wine, I've been beat down a lot and you just get tough skin. We were blind tasting a wine, which again, we don't know what it is. My boss was like, I got some cool stuff open. Only 10% on average. Some areas in Southern California are as low as 4%. The highest American viticultural area for women in wine as lead winemakers is Marin County at 14%. 14% is the highest in California. It's awesome. So that's cool. Anyway, we were doing a blind tasting and my boss pours me the wine and I'm actually sitting in the dark at this point because I have like ice packs on my cheek. And he's like, "What do you think it is?" And I sniffed it, and I was like, "I've had this wine before." And he's like, maybe you have." I was like, "Okay, cool." So I look at it and I sniff it, and I'm like, within a minute or two, I was like, "This is like 2008, 2007 from our winery, right?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I was like, "It's Pinot, isn't it?" He's like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Cool, rad." Got the vintage, got the producer, got the varietal. Couple minutes. Sick. So I'm sitting in the office because I'm literally sitting in the dark by myself with ice packs, and I finally decide to be social. And so I come back into the cellar, and all, the interns, who are men, of course, and the two winemakers, who are men, of course, are standing in a circle. And without even thinking about it, my winemaker's like, "Okay, guys, all right, boys, like, what do you think this is?" And I was just over it. I was like, "I am right here. I'm standing right next to you." And he's like, "Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I forgot that you were here." Something that doesn't validate the comment, right? And I was just like, yeah, great, cool. But that's one of the things in the industry that's kind of rough sometimes. And why I've also worked really hard on Evenings of Enology to bring people like Megan on, who is a winemaker. And granted, she had to start her own line to be a lead winemaker. But still, Megan is a head winemaker of Margins Wine, her own label that she started off of a Kickstarter fund. It's honestly like a rags to riches story. It's pretty amazing. I mean, she's still not making a ton of money. Megan also has 2 jobs. But she's hustling, man. She's booking. That's why I had Abby on. Abby is an enologist and has gone through stuff that I don't want to share because it's her personal life, but she makes my garbage look like a piece of scrap paper on the floor. Like, just absolutely amazing women. And so it's really important to try and support women in the wine industry, because fucking no one else is going to, it feels like sometimes. But so do you think it's ever in the cards for you to run your own female-run winery? So yes, I wanted to flip this positively really quickly. I don't know if I'll ever have my own winery, because there's also a saying in wine where it's if you want to make a small fortune in wine, you must first start with a large fortune, which means that oftentimes you lose money in wine, and it's very expensive. So I don't think I'll ever have my own winery, but there are some wineries. So an area I want to highlight that I've just fallen in love with recently is Paso Robles in California. When I went down to Paso after a camping trip, I hadn't showered in like 3 or 4 days, looked awful. They were so welcoming and so warming that it was incredibly inspiring. And one of the wineries that I discovered down there is a winery called Desperada. And Desperada is an all-female production team. I just got chills. Like, it's amazing. It's an all-female production team. It's the only all-female production team that I've ever seen. And granted, of course, the person who started it as a woman was like, "I'm going to support women in this industry. I want to do this. This is my jam." And they're doing weird shit, and people are loving it. And so certain areas are just, they're really trying. And the community of Paso totally supports Desperada and totally supports Valia. Her name is Valia, the head winemaker, and their team, and they're like totally behind their heels. So some communities aren't as archaic as others, but it's really, really slow, but it's happening. And so that gives me like a little bit of like, excitement for the future of wine, for women in wine specifically, because there are women in wine, but they're all in the front of the house, which is totally fine. When I say front of the house, sorry, I mean like tasting room or sales and stuff. And those positions hold a lot of value. Like, if no one sold our wine, we wouldn't be here because we wouldn't make any money. Like, good, right? So we do need people in those positions, but it's a shame that women get pigeonholed into positions of sales where you're interacting with customers. And I'm sure we can all figure out why. And they get shoved out of the back of the cellar. And so, yes, if you want to try something cool, if you're in an area that has a cool wine shop, just walk into the wine shop and be like, "Hey, I want to buy a wine from a female winemaker. Can you help me with that?" And just like talk to people about these kinds of things, like it's rough. It's really, really rough. But It's awesome. Thank you. Thanks for letting me share. And I'm glad you're enjoying me sharing. On a brighter note, wine is still really cool. And I do love the people that I work with. And is my light bulb going out? No. And one thing I would also like to encourage people to think about in wine is, so I take a lot of my experiences from understanding mentorship and leadership and teaching and pedagogy, and I apply them to work. So an example, and this is actually going to, I'm not going to end on a downer, I swear. But at one point at work, at the winery, one of the people at the winery who is a winemaker, I don't want to say who, but a winemaker at the winery, there's two at the winery. We had our interns in, and they'd only been in there for like a couple of weeks, and I was working with the interns on how to do something really basic. It's a thing called topping, whatever. Telling them topping protocols, what lots to top, how to sulfur, and whatever. And my winemaker was working with the other winemaker doing, I just made up some blending trials, and they were tasting through the blending trials. So different worlds in the winery, right? And the winemaker came in, and he was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm telling the interns to do this, that, and the other." And he was like, "Why would you do that?" I was like, "Oh, well, we always do it like that. This is just a standard protocol for topping." And he's like, "Caileen, we always go through and do the whole winery first, and then we go back and do lot by lot." And I was like, "Oh, okay, like this is news to me. Would you like us to do this instead of that?" And basically what happened was there was a big miscommunication. We were saying the exact same things. And he put his hands up and said, "Caileen, I told you this 3 times. Are you not listening to me?" And he yelled at me in the workplace right in front of the interns. So the next day I had to send him an email and just say, "I don't appreciate you yelling at me. That is unprofessional. And if you need to talk to me in a more constructive manner, please do so in this way. Like, have a great day at the vineyard." It's important to recognize that even in positions where you feel like you have been mistreated, and I obviously was, like I was yelled at the workplace in front of the interns, right? You still need to approach those very professionally and with leadership and mentorship skills that are productive. And so the whole point of that was to say that there is room for women in wine. You just have to be a little more political in how you navigate that right now, which is a huge pain in the ass. But at some point in time, if enough people are supporting women in wine, maybe we can get to the point where we, don't have to tell people to not yell at us in the workplace. Like, I'm like, dude, this is like stuff I say to a 5-year-old. Like, come on. But that resolved itself just fine. And the whole point of that is to say to stand up for yourself very constructively and productively. And that was a good lesson for me, because that was like the first time I really stood up for myself in that kind of, in a wine setting. And it taught me that I can do that, and like the world's not going to go up in flames and end. So that was pretty cool. As far as things that I want to preach, and please, again, ask any and all questions. We only have like 7 minutes left. Ask any questions you have. Things I want to preach about wine are to respect wine. Wine is a very rich cultural and social product. It's also an agricultural product fundamentally. Megan talks a lot about how wine is just a product of agriculture, and she doesn't want it to be like hoity-toity. And I totally agree. While wine deserves a place at a table of sophistication, it also deserves a place at your bedside and watching Netflix. The consumption of wine is pretty low in the United States. Places like Italy and France, these are stats from a while ago, but consume anywhere from like 50 to 70 liters of wine a year per person. And the US is at around 4 to 10. And as a beverage, it has a lot of health benefits if you consume it in moderation, like everything should be. It also can connect you to areas of the world that you haven't been to before. It's almost like being able to time or like teleport somewhere, like you can almost taste what the food and culture might be like in a certain area by trying a wine that is truly of that area. And so I want to encourage you to try wines and diversify your palate for that reason, and then also because there's just some cool shit out there, dude. If you want to try some of the, the new hot button topics in wine, there's a region in France called Jura. Jura is northeastern France, and it's a very, very cool climate. And they're working with a lot of white wine oxidation practices. So you can get some really crazy, cool aromatics there. Australia is doing some really fantastic stuff in wine overall. Australia has always had a pretty rich wine culture as far as the New World is concerned. But their wines are really fantastic. Natural wines are making a rise. So they're also called natty wines, which we talked about in Megan's episode. These are wines that are typically made with native yeast fermentation, so you don't inoculate them, and are oftentimes not sulfured. And they take on a completely different aromatic profile from conventional wines. So these are all fun things that you can try in the wine world now, which you couldn't. Well, and it's ironic, because literally hundreds of years ago, everything was natural wine. But for the life and the time that we've been alive, most wines have not been natural. And so you can try and get into that realm now. And some people say, that natural wines make them, less of a hangover or whatever. But it's cool that you can try it, and that's a thing now. Random question. Why do you want to taste a wine that has a petrol or tire taste? Thinking back to my tasting course. Oh my God, seriously. Oh, you're touching on one of my favorite wines in the whole world. So we talked about this in Evenings of Enology as well. It was the episode where we talked about characteristics, compounds in wine. I can't remember what it was titled. I can look back on my notes and figure it out. But that petrol character comes from a very distinct molecule, and it's common in Riesling, among a couple of other things. So some people don't like it, and some people can't smell it as well. So there's chemicals have a limit of detection on them, and I think that one is pretty low, so most people can smell it. I love it. Some people don't. But if you're looking at it from a chemosensory perspective or from a tasting perspective, if you smell that compound in your wine, you can almost always figure out what wine it is, because very few wines have it. German Riesling being the most common one. I get it in Chenin Blanc sometimes as well. So Chenin from the Loire region of France can sometimes have that petrol-y characteristic. Tires sometimes rubber a little bit. So you want to taste it because it can help you guess a wine. You don't have to enjoy it. I enjoy it. I love it. And those Rieslings and Chenins are typically also Riesling in particular is very high acid, very low pH. So you just have this mouth-wateringly gorgeous aromatic wine that smells like petrol, and it just makes me so happy. So you don't have to like it, but I do. I am actually almost out of time, guys and gals and folks and y'all and friends and homies. So thank you again for hanging out with me and the SciCommunity every Tuesday/Friday for a couple of them, for 10 weeks, except last week because I got holes poked in my face to remove my teeth. It's been awesome talking to you. If you have any questions, I always forget to plug myself and to tell you where to find me. I'm so bad at this. Usually Patrick reminds me, but Patrick isn't here. So if you want to follow me and you're not, you can find me at Kmarison is my personal handle, Caimarison. If you want to specifically follow Enology and Wine Facts, you can follow the Field Blend Project. So it's at the Field Blend Project. Field as in a field of grains or grapes. So the Field Blend Project is devoted to education, community, science, and wine, and spreading information about wine from a scientific perspective to bring the artistic side of wine and the scientific side of wine together. So you can follow me either at my personal handle or at the Field Blend Project and keep up with all my wine nerd stuff there. All right, I got 28 seconds, so I should go. Bye. You guys have been awesome. Hit me up whenever you want about wine questions or whatever. I'm an open book for better or for worse, and I have no filter. So if you're into that, come hang out with me. See you guys later. Bye. Oh, right. I should end the Nexus, shouldn't I? Bye, Nexus.